The purpose of this lecture is to set the context for part two of America is in the Heart. The first thing to keep in mind as you're reading is the author's narrative style. So you need to keep in mind that there are two narrative voices that you will hear. One is that of an analytical Carlos Pulusan, who has grown wise and politically savvy with the hard experiences that he's had in the United States. And so when referring to the author, we'll call him Pulusan. The second is a much younger voice, and that voice is of Alos. So this is Carlos's nickname, and he's more naive and prone to questioning the reason for the hardships that befall on him and his fellows. He doesn't fully understand why what is happening should be happening to him. And so when we're referring to the character, we'll call him Alos. To give you an example of how you see this, because it is interwoven, if you remember from page 83, this is where Bulusan shares the anecdote about the Filipino teacher who sort of sets Alos up to get one of the highest grades on the national exam. And in the first two paragraphs on this page, what you hear is told from Alos's point of view. There's no analysis of why this is happening. It's just sort of an explanation of the teacher, a description of him, what he does, what he says. And in the third paragraph, suddenly you get a shift and you see more analysis. And here, Bolusan steps away from being the character and inserts his voice to explain the significance of this experience. This is where he is more direct with the message he's sending the reader, right? He's telling you that this is about learning about the Philippine middle class. And he uses these anecdotes as a vehicle for a larger message. So the key here is to ask yourself, is the event described being experienced or analyzed? If it's being experienced, then it's about the character Alos. If it's being analyzed, it's the author inserting his point of view about the experience's significance and thus sending the reader a more direct message. There are two big things we need to cover about the context of part two. The first is in terms of work, and the second is in terms of race. You'll read a lot about farm and cannery work. The first image you see here captures the work that Alos had to do when he first landed in the United States. So you'll read about how he landed in Seattle and then immediately was taken up to Alaska to do some work. And then later he does a lot of field work, and you'll read about him picking peas and lettuce and a whole bunch of other vegetables. What you need to keep in mind about this work is that it is temporary and it requires workers to be physically capable and mobile. And the locations that you'll read about, including Alaska, like I've already mentioned, or California and Oregon, Washington, Utah, New Mexico, and Filipinos, like other immigrants, especially Mexican and Chinese, looked for these jobs and moved around with the seasons. And the result of this was that there were entire towns that became kind of transient. So you'll read about how businesses followed the workers and how certain establishments were put in place to take advantage of these workers with their newly earned money. And some of the businesses you'll read about are gambling establishments and bars and prostitution. All these establishments were meant to tempt the workers because, in theory, what they're doing is gaining money so that they can have a better life. But these establishments are built to take that money away. Um, as I said, the other part of the context that you need to understand is the racialized context. So, unlike other immigrants, as you read in part one, Filipinos had been formally educated about American ideals since the US colonized their country at the turn of the 20th century, which is why Alos can speak about his new country's ideals in part one. However, the Philippines standing as an American colony did not make its people be better perceived than the United States. Alos came at a time when there was an increased influx of migrant workers. So laws were passed to keep immigrants in what the dominant society believed to be their place. Remember, the Philippines was a territory of the U.S., so Filipinos could come freely and were not subject to immigration quotas, at least not until 1934. However, they entered an environment that thought of non-whites as a danger to the white race. Remember, in part one, you were introduced to this concept of otherness, and this is going to play a prominent role in part two. And there were two specific reasons that Americans were upset with the increased Filipino population. The first is that they undercut wages. So just like other immigrants, they were used as cheap labor. And since they had fewer rights, it was easier to take advantage of them and not have them fight back. And the second is that they were seen as wanting to marry white women. So these two other primary sources here, you see the negative sentiment that Filipinos faced. And it did happen that Filipinos ended up with white women because the majority of Filipinos who came to America were males. So there was huge backlash against any sort of interracial marriage, including that between, or interracial unions, not just marriage, but including that between Filipinos and whites. In terms of thematic topics, there are three that you need to pay specific attention to. And as you're identifying these topics, think about what the message the author is sending about them. The first is alienation and despair. And you're going to see Alos changing through the experiences that he has. So think about, how is his character impacted by those experiences? What positive things happen? What negative things happen? What outweighs what? And specifically, what outside forces teach Alos lessons related to survival. The second is individual obligation to others. And here, you really need to think about unity and separation. What causes people to be united or torn apart? And what's the role society plays in shaping people's attitudes towards each other that either help or deteriorate any sort of unity? And lastly, you'll now see the theme of the American dream play a much more prominent role. And you'll see that through Alos's understanding of America. So continue to follow his understanding of the American dream, especially as his social awakening continues and is shaped by the racial attitudes of his new country. And think about how Alos's understanding of America is developed and how does it change in this section. As always, in a week, you will be expected to write another thought paper. You will get a choice between 5 different questions to answer within that thought paper. They are listed here. They all have to do with the Alos's experience in the U.S. and his perception of this country. The first asks you to analyze the author's perspective on whether the United States deserves its reputation as a land of opportunity. A second question asks, so what responsibility does the U.S. have to immigrants who come to this country? And again, according to the author. And the third is, according to the author, what impact does coming to the U.S. have on immigrants? The fourth is, according to the author, what does the treatment that he experiences in America communicate about this country's values and morals? And finally, how was he alienated and what were the results of that alienation? You should be annotating with these questions in mind. On Friday, you will participate in your second mini seminar. The facilitators will select 3 out of these 5 questions to discuss through specific passages, and you will again engage in a closed reading exercise to help you understand how the author addresses these questions and these topics.